So thank you. I think this is a great level setting baseline because I think when we talk about AI, we always think about what AI could do. And in fact, I'm sure many of us have got vendors or requests or even advertisement is like, AI could do this now. AI could fulfill your dreams and destinies. So I want to get a sense of what is it that AI couldn't do? What are some of the misconceptions of AI right now?
Well, I think one thing is that AI is sort of extremely limited in understanding context. So, for example, AI is quite good at if you have a task that runs along the lines of, here's a photo, is there a bird in it, or is there a cat in it, right? But it's a lot more, it's a lot worse, I would say, at doing something like, here's an image, is there extremist content inside of it, right? And because the skills you need in order to solve that type of problem requires just a lot more context and is actually a great deal more sort of subjective and involves a lot more human judgment. And AI is kind of very far away from accomplishing those types of tasks.
I guess I would just say that AI is not even that good at photos. I'm sorry to be the party pooper here, sure. But we have so many terrible examples about AI misclassifying. So probably you may or may not know the story about Google's automatic tagging of photos where it tried to guess what's in your photo and put a little caption. And so it didn't, it tagged a photo of black faces as gorillas. And it basically was a failure of their machine learning system that they hadn't sort of adequately trained it, right? They had trained it incorrectly, and so it learned bad things. And unfortunately, that's not an isolated experience, right? There's been the work of Joy Boilamwini at MIT Media Lab has been constantly testing all of the facial recognition software that's out in the market and showing that consistently they fail to identify black faces accurately. And this is terrifying because this is software that's actually rolling out to police departments and law enforcement right now. And so I just want to say that it's not even that good at image recognition.
Right now, machine learning is a moving target. Lots of problems, lots of advances. For example, voice recognition on my phone is now ready for prime time. Makes mistakes, but it's still useful. The idea is that if improperly used, like with facial recognition, it can result in tragedy. And if used in a half-assed way, let's say for Google Photos, it can be useful, but sometimes hilarious. For example, it confuses my pictures of American robins with pictures of hermit thrushes, which of course is tremendously hilarious. The deal is, it's a moving target, and it is right now misapplied in ways that can get people killed.
And even in this short brief, we talk about AI, there's algorithm, there's machine learning, there's voice assistant. I mean, the fundamental principle, should we even use the terminology AI in our sort of day-to-day conversation, or should we be just really narrowly focused on which branch of the technology? How do you feel about sort of this notion of like AI being thrown around?
I try not to use the word AI. I try to use automated decision making. I think it makes more sense to people, like, oh, I understand what an automated decision is. And there's all sorts of nightmarish semantic fights within the AI field about whether what you're talking about is AI or machine learning. So for instance, the software that we wrote about that scores criminals about whether they're likely to commit a future crime is not a machine learning algorithm. And so a lot of people were like, oh, well, it's not an AI investigation. And it's like, okay, I don't really care if it's an AI investigation. It's an automated decision-making tool that's being brought into the court system. And I think it's important to write about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth talking about AI insofar as that it influences all of these decisions, and that in fact there are lots of tools being sold under the banner of AI, when largely it is sort of just a repackaging of what has sort of existed before. And so I think it's useful to challenge the use of that word and to actively be like kind of part of how that term is evolving in society.
Yeah, AI perhaps is more of a marketing term now than a fact-based term. I like Julia's terminology, maybe best of all.
And when we think about, the local communities, how should they frame the questions and issues of AI for civic leaders, for local community foundation funders? And it's, because now it's so buzzy, right? Some of them just like, oh, they are using AI to solve this community problem. Should I fund it? Should I not fund it? Like, how should we help people even frame the question locally? Because I think most of the conversation really happen at a much higher level, at a national level. Yeah, Tim?
I mean, I think the key question there is whether or not you frame it up as technology is going to solve this social problem. And I think that framing tends to be sort of extremely dangerous just because it tends to lead to deployments of the technology that really don't take kind of the complexity of some of these problems into account. And so I guess maybe, at first assessment, I think that's like one thing that really needs to change about how we frame up some of this stuff to local communities.
Yeah. I've been putting it from a different context as an ethical question, because a lot of the people involved in all this, at least on the coding or software side, are people at social media platforms who could use a reminder to treat people like they want to be treated. This applies to AI or machine learning or automated decision making per the fiction that I alluded to earlier. And this is a big topic because right now the Center for Humane Technology is trying to get into this more. The computer sciences, the ethical challenge is trying to get into this more. That's some of the stuff that I'm funding. In this, I'm increasingly influenced by ethicists like Anand Giridharadas and also Chidi Anagonye. And only one of those is fictional, but I take both seriously. Thank you.
I guess I would say there's 3 questions I would ask about any automated decision-making system, whether you're a funder or whether you're a journalist covering it. And I think that there's 3 things I always think about. Like, 1, how does this affect human autonomy, right? What does it mean for people's autonomy in their life? If there's a system that, I think we've all gotten okay with the idea that you just automatically get a ticket if you speed in an area where they have some sensors. But are we willing to do that with going to jail? Like, are we willing to do that with high stakes human decisions? And so that's the first question. The second question I would ask about all automated tools is due process. What is the due process around it? What is your ability to dispute the findings and to examine those findings? As you may or may not know, in Europe, they've just passed the GDPR Privacy Act, which actually gives citizens the right to demand an explanation of some sort of automated decision making. We don't have that right here in the US, but we could ask for it as citizens. And then I guess finally, the other thing is I think all these tools should be tested for disparate impact, right? We have so much evidence that the few tools that have been tested, the facial recognition tools, the criminal justice tools, are biased against people of color. And like, I continue to find that in every examination of these tools. And so it seems like an appropriate test of any automated tool is, have you examined whether it has any bias and whether it's disparate impact?
Has there a lot of talk within the companies, the technologists, and even sort of in local government about the ethics and governance of AI, right? Because I think it's one of these, again, AI, we meet so many marketers who use that word and I just feel bad for them because they're just reading a brochure with a 3 bullet point and they have to come out and sell you this thing. Like, is there a governance structure? Is there like a governing body that talk about, AI for good versus bad?
I mean, there's the Partnership for AI, which is the leading tech companies have gotten together to come up with a framework, an ethical framework for the use of AI. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think they've released this framework yet, but they're working on it. So, and it's actually all the big companies. It's Apple, Google, Microsoft, IBM. So it's a good faith effort. I think there's a lot of good-hearted people trying to work on this issue, but these tools are out there now, and actually the ones that I'm most worried about are not built by those companies, right? Like, this software in criminal justice system is one of 24 types of such software used in the criminal justice system throughout this country, right? Without much independent oversight. And then there are systems like this the police use for predictive policing, and there are systems like this that people use for hiring, where they scan resumes to decide who to hire. And I remember when Amazon came out recently and said, oh, oops, our hiring software discriminated against all women, right? Like, that shouldn't be okay, right? And so the problem is there's enormous areas of software and automated decision making where actually those big companies are not running those programs. And in fact, it's the smaller companies that are more likely to make those types of mistakes.
Yeah, and I think we've gone through an interesting arc, at least with the big companies on this, which is, I think, thanks largely to the credit of journalists kind of like digging into some of these issues. I think a lot of the companies are now saying, oh, you got us. Like, we're working on ethics in AI. And I think now there's a moment to try to hold them to those promises to avoid, effectively an emergence of kind of greenwashing in the space where you say, we have an ethics team, they sign off on stuff, and it's all good, so you don't need to worry about it anymore.
Yeah. I kind of like the idea of quiet back-channel diplomacy, reminding people of what they kind of already know, and that seems to work. I guess we should apply it to smaller companies, because I keep thinking of a recent video from Boston Dynamics, which has a kind of robotic dog, much like Metalhead from Black Mirror. And I think 6 weeks ago, they showed it learning how to open a door. And that's terribly disturbing, because in the fictional version of Metalhead, learns to get all stabby. And I really don't want a robot becoming stabby that learns how to open a door.
Wow. So I just want to leave some room for questions. So.
Good timing. Thank you. We'll go here and then here.
And please identify who you are, and I would love it if you actually have a question.
I have a question. I'm Stephen Livingston from George Washington University. First of all, I appreciate Chidi. I think he's one of the world's great underappreciated philosophers. But moving on from that, the panel has decided to sort of focus on machine learning as one of the central, most important features of artificial intelligence. But I wonder if anyone would be interested in commenting on deep learning or on reinforcement learning. Somebody mentioned a moment ago about AlphaGo, but after AlphaGo was AlphaZero, which throughout this is getting a little wonky, I know, but it throughout the machine learning and just simply used a reinforcement mechanism within the system itself. And what's startling about that is the accelerated pace of advancement in capabilities that were found when you remove the human from the element. This leads to other considerations, such as generative adversarial networks and deep fakes, generally speaking, face-to-face transplant. This has tremendous implications for journalism and for truth-telling through images. I wonder if the panel has anything to say about that. This is this phenomenon where one can take a face and digitally insert it onto another person's body, or generative adversarial networks where an entirely fictitious image is produced through deep neural networks. Again, it has tremendous implications for the future of truth-telling through what looks like photography. Does anyone have any thoughts on this?
I think I would start by saying that I think it's increasingly incumbent on journalists to consider themselves forensic researchers, right? Our job is to bring people the truth, and we need to verify that truth. We have a tradition for human sources of how we verify, but for digital sources, we don't have good standards and practices. That's one reason my newsroom is going to be half programmers, so that we can try to bring the best technology to bear on these kinds of questions.
Sure, I guess I tend to be a little bit on the other side of the deepfakes debate. So some of you may have seen these demonstrations where machine learning is used to create very believable video and audio. And I guess I tend to be skeptic about the long-term impact of it, largely because it's so cheap to spread disinformation without fancy machine learning tools, right? That you can actually just through text do a great job at spreading disinformation. And I think that a lot of the people conducting very organized campaigns of propaganda tend to be pragmatists. They want the biggest amount of disinformation for the lowest spend. And so I'm still skeptical about the long-term impact of it on the information ecosystem. But I think it's a much larger debate that we can definitely have.
I'm Lee Kiesler from the library in Charlotte. My question for the three of you is, if tomorrow someone gave you the keys to a public library system, how would you use AI to serve customers in the community better?
We're not going to the next question. That was a good one.
Does that mean I don't have to learn the Dewey Decimal System?
I mean, maybe one thing just to throw it out, I'll jump in, is, so we have some cases where machine learning is used every day to great effect, right? And it doesn't mean that it doesn't have any problems. But I actually wonder whether or not things like search actually get really improved, not just for like the world's biggest search engines, but eventually for institutions that need to get information to people in all forms. And so I think there's an interesting application there.
Yeah. Aside from my imagination failing me, my gut tells me that the need and use of librarians that'll be with us indefinitely. My guess is until we get something as smart as true intelligence, librarians are going to be better than software in helping us. My bias has to do with librarians helping me find science fiction to read 50 or 60 years ago.
I mean, I think one of the ways is you look at AI as a companion, right? So imagine every librarian have an AI companion that could sort of do these recommendations. So some of you are really way young, but for some of us who went to the library to do research back then, I could imagine a librarian using an AI to help find those wonky sci-fi fictions that we don't normally find from the without looking through the, I don't know, that catalog-y thing. Questions?
More questions?
In the back, right behind you.
Hey, I'm Georgia Coleman. I'm with Richland Library, so another librarian. And this might be a silly question, but you alluded to robots getting stabby. And I just wonder about whether you see a real existential threat from artificial intelligence.
The idea of robots, perhaps magically or through bicameral mind work, if they achieve consciousness, what are they going to do with us? Like, what if they take over the nuclear launch systems, like in Terminator and Skynet? And we don't really know, because that kind of robotic intelligence might be very different than human intelligence. They might transcend human consciousness, sublimate, as they say in science fiction, and just disappear completely. They might decide we're annoying and decide to wipe us out, or they might keep us as pets. The Ian Banks culture novels talk about that pretty well. The novels of The Matrix talk about keeping us around to be biological batteries, which is actually not viable, but interesting and scary to think about. All this means no one really knows, because no one knows what the nature of that kind of consciousness would be. It does make for some great speculation and some great science fiction and some great special effects, even if the sequels don't really work out.
I mean, I think one way of reframing these issues is that AI is actually already quite existential. It depends on who you talk to, right? At the point where you have these systems make decisions around bail or use them to determine for predictive policing, for instance. Yeah, I think the implications are quite existential already in some ways.
Tom Johnson from the New Mexico Foundation for Open Government. Oftentimes, AI or machine learning will produce a result that will show up often as a number. It might be a probability, it might be something on a scale, could even be a color. Has anybody, in terms of civic concern, had some case law where the vending agency was required to produce their complete algorithm and the sources and quality of the data that led to that final statistic or data point?
So there's a lot of interest in the algorithm itself, and I have to say I think that interest is often misguided. I'll give you two reasons why. One, the night before we published the Compass investigation, the company that built that software, we had sent them all of our data and our methodology. We'd spoken to them for months. And in a last-ditch effort to convince us that they didn't mean to be biased, which, by the way, we didn't accuse them of, they sent me the algorithm. They said, it's secret, you can't share it with anyone, but here's what it is. So they sent it to me. It was a linear equation, okay? And it was a bunch of inputs multiplied by a constant plus another bunch of inputs multiplied by a constant. And I have a math degree. The programmers I work with are smart. I defy you to look at that algorithm and say the output is likely to be biased in the error rates in this particular way. Like that isn't, the only way you would ever get to that analysis is by actually running stuff through the algorithm and seeing what the outputs look like. So I think that like the focus on the transparency of the algorithm itself can be misguided. I'll tell you another story. At ProPublica, we wrote a story about the New York City Crime Lab had decided to build its own DNA matching algorithm. Although there were many out there, including the FBI's, which is the best in class, they were like, we also would like to build an algorithm so we can match the DNA we find on the gun with the DNA of a person that we suspect. So they built their own secret algorithm. No one ever saw it. And it was used for almost a decade, and about 10,000 people were convicted based on it. And it was challenged in court, and a computer scientist came in and looked at the algorithm, and he said, this thing has errors in the code. So the court sealed the algorithm, but the city quietly retired it and put in a new algorithm that was more accepted and better known. We FOIA'd ProPublica, we did a public records request for that sealed algorithm at the court, and we got it unsealed. We published it. We published the whole thing. And nobody has actually done that, and we called for people to analyze it. And the truth is, it's really hard to analyze. I've spoken to a lot, you have to be a DNA expert and a C# programming expert, and you would need some training data to run through it to see the outputs. And so there hasn't been much outcome from it, although it's sitting on the ProPublica website right now, and you're welcome to look at it. And so I think like the algorithms themselves don't reveal, it's the outputs that reveal the truth. And so I think we have to focus on analyzing those outputs.
Tim, do you have something to add? Or you just...
Oh, no, just it's a great case, so just take a note.
So final questions, you know, AI, opportunity or a problem? Why?
Both, because it can be used to improve our lives, but it could also result in, and has resulted in, tragedy.
I mean, I guess my spin on it would be like sort of in reaching for the opportunity too early, we may actually run into a lot of the problems of the technology, right? That the kind of promise of AI is so great in some ways that we sort of rush into the deployment of these technologies before really kind of thinking about what they're doing. And so, you know, I guess in some ways the sort of opportunity is getting in a way of actually kind of like realizing the opportunity.
Yes, I mean, I'm going to echo all of you, but I guess I feel like AI is no different than the rest of tech, and tech is really, it's a tool. And what humans do with tools is they use them both to grow food and as weapons. And so I feel like my job is to mitigate the harm and notice the parts where technology is used as a weapon and try to make sure we shine a light on that. And I think that, but to see it as anything other than a tool that can be used for good and bad is probably just to simplify the situation.
Great. With that, we want to thank you for your insight.
Thank you all.